Opnieuw? Okay, welcome. Welcome to the second day of Iterations. I'm Fabian van Sluis. I'm the creative director of CCU, Creative Coding Utrecht, and we're a platform that supports digital creativity and creative coding as artistic practice. Today we're at the second day of Iterations, and this is a symposium that we organized together with Vera van der Zijp. She is unfortunately not here, but she's online in the chat in the YouTube stream, where the rest of all the participants or the audience is gathering. Yesterday we had 3 amazing speakers. Babusi Neoni gave us a talk about dancing in the metaverse and representation. The second talk, I'm forgetting again. The second talk was by Olivia Jack. She dove into Hydra as a live coding platform. And the third talk was by Tiga Brain, sorry. It's the third day of the festival, so bear with me. So today we have 3 speakers. Meng Chuan is here. I will introduce her in a bit. Followed by the second talk by Aymeric and Brandon Howell. And we finalized the day with a talk by Mandy Su. So first up is Meng Chuan Sun. She's a new media artist based in Berlin. Her works are based on audiovisual live performances and experimental video installations. And she creates her work with game engines to describe the formation of her own spiritual world with 3D visual materials. It's more like an exploration and adventure in the virtual world with a strong sense of the unknown to imagine a neo-romantic future. I'm super curious how that looks like. Give her a big hand.
Hello, I'm Meng Xuan. Thanks for coming. And thanks. Thanks for your introductions. And I'm Meng Xuan, come from China. Between human and technology, or various types of existence in the future, I defined my work as a neo-romantic futurism. And most of my works based on audiovisual live performance, experimental videos, and interactive AR or VR installations. And today I will present my 3 works in order of time, from the construction of the idea to collaboration with technology and design to achievement of my work. So in addition of the works themselves, it's also important for me to create the context of the site and the exhibition, how to change the way of the visitors to view my works. And the first work is Ding. So it's an audio visual live performance. It's talking about the relationship changed by the network, provide people a shared utopia vision, and everything can be generated information or delivered. And now QR code is everywhere. But the piece created in 2019, before the COVID. At that time, I'm almost familiar with paying cash in Germany. So when I back to China, visit my family, so really feel the moving payment change a lot there. So almost everyone has a mobile wallet at that time, and just scan the QR code on the phone. You can just pay everything, and even there's a slogan of Alipay called scan, easy to pay. So it QR code appears in every corner in our society, and in front of the squat, on the seat of the sharing bicycle, the door of church even. So before the sculptures, some when you visit the sculptures, visiting the museum, you also can scan the QR code in front of the sculptures. And I saw pictures from the internet, inspired me a lot, so I made this thing. I put like the QR code of my Alipay. So if for this Buddha sculpture, and if you scan this QR code, you can literally pay me to send me the money. And so I also have some like questions. How do our actions in the virtual world reflect back to our physical space? Because nowadays human brains like adopt the word which symbolism with human race and intelligence machines. The human body becomes an interface that connects reality and virtuality. We are no longer considered to be a natural objects that God has made with clay, and the this common payment, like you scan the barcode reader in the supermarket. From this, when I saw this situation happened in front of me, I really feel like the human make machines and parasitic on machines. The machine becomes an extension of our body. This QR scanner with our hand to finish this action altogether. So it's already natural for us to pick up the barcode scanner at the supermarket, right? So, but we didn't realize we already co-working together for this society. And the technology advance and development of the internet have changed the way people live, act, and behave, and bring the daily action to be a part of this performance. So I use a quick QR barcode scanner.
The world loves
Sorry, repeat.
all beings as are playable for other life forms, whether natural or artificial.
So this, I use a barcode scanner to scan the QR code and randomly turn into the voice system, and comes with a computer program to read it out, and use SuperCollider. This is a sound software and generated sound with a test together that the video shows. And this is a performance sense, and designed a system to show this piece. So like the gesture capture with the lip motion, use the gestures to control two kinetic, this green, small green kinetic installations, and the two objects emitting laser light are the head of my avatar that I printed with a 3D printer. And like that, and the output three different camera views with a similar storyline as 3 channels video, and just as 3 channels video. And we because sometimes I think we did 3D stuffs from the computer, but we still show it in a 2D monitors. So I have more care about how to change the different make like dimensions to show my work. And that's sorry, yeah. So that's a live performance, but at that time, I hope I can build installations like after the live performance, even the performer and artist won't be on site. You still can see what happens after that, after the live performance. So the place with the installations can still provide the informations there. And the next one is VR with video installations called Taichu 3030. It's about digital soul in the cyber world and imagine immortality in the future. As I sat in front of my computer, facing to the screens, and the online conference showed the video images of everyone, like we are doing now, and looking so close but yet so far away, as if I was having conversation with a pile of data. So I began to rethink the relationship between the human physical body, data, space, and the network, confronting tensions between the utopia promises of technology, progress, and humanity. That work explores the feelings surrounding physical immortality and digital preservation. And the culture, my culture manifestation in Chinese tradition and symbols, and in traditional Chinese, the phrase Taichu means the very beginning. And I also saw same sentence on the first page on Bible. So mixing poetic imagery with cultural reference to the Christ of immortality in Chinese mythologies, I created this piece at the beginning of the pandemic. So at that time, the living of human beings all over the world are at risk, and we all desire for how to survive, how to live. So, and because my culture background and legends are actually a large part of the story, we grew up listening and watching TV shows and film in China, and the search works will have a concept of the immortality in it. So I will introduce this. I mean, I'm not sure if you know this. This book also is a film in China called Journey to the West. It's a legend story, and the story actually is about a monk, and they go all the way to the west to get Buddhist scriptures happened on the way, and the monk name is Tang Sanzang, and the story usually involves Tang Sanzang being captured and having his life stripped. So while his disciples try to find a way to save him, and they more frequently consist of run-ins with various demons, and because they can gain internal life by eating the flesh of Tang Sanzang. So I think we can feel the human desire for immortality all the time, and alchemists have presences in both in East and West culture, and the concept of immortality enters to the video game in the future nowadays also. And I think about how the physical body will one day maybe disappeared, but what about the data we leave behind in the cyber world and social media, and what about these digital souls that are forgotten because of the losing the physical bodies? So that might be a future in the future. Could be a business opportunity. I think I'm sure now definitely some company is working on it. So I set the background, how to guide you into an internal life. And at the beginning of the videos, I use a part of the poem called. I think I don't need the sound here. And the network. Sorry. The network is everlasting. So this is the first version, and I set 4 different scenes in Unity, 4 chapters, and to guide you into an internal life. Yeah, and the first one is a screen, on the street and wandering in different through different screens. And the second one is a guide space, let you enter into the internal life space, and slowly you can get the guide how to use your data from the cyberspace after you died. And this, I also write some scripts for this piece and can ties the 4 scenes together. And it's a space, and this a space where you can talk directly with a person who has passed away. I can show part of this of the video works. Oops, sorry.
There is always somebody asleep and someone awake. Someone dreaming asleep, someone dreaming awake. Someone eating, someone hungry. Someone fighting, someone loving. Someone traveling, someone staying put. Someone helping, someone hindering. Someone enjoying, someone suffering.
Yes, it's because this video is about 20 minutes, so I can just show very short of them. And I in the sound file, the beginning you listen is I use a sound we usually we are in China. When we graduated from the school, it's used for say goodbye to your friends. So I think it's really based on the atmosphere at the beginning. So I generated this part of the sound for this video. And in this video, I bring the better version of me, this concept, because if it's really fun, because if you use a Nike Run app, basically you can hear this sentence every time when you use it, when you finish a running trip. And I use my avatar since 2016. So basically, I create different version of from my physical body, but bring it to the virtual worlds. In this piece, I just update my avatar again. So I update my avatar as not looks more like game character. Not looks like me in the daily life. So And in this video, I also create a virtual company called Second Nature. So this company basically provide this service to update your data and how you use your data for the internal life. And the next page is how to show the work in the physical way, because it's a VR work. But from my own experience of visiting exhibitions, especially the VR exhibitions, usually people always waiting on queue to use the VR glasses. And this work of mine is a real-time rendering videos. So not only a video playing on the VR glasses, and the visitor who is waiting can basically do nothing there, or perhaps the VR view of the moment can be extended through another screen, so that visitors cannot wearing glasses still can watch it, but the VR view on the screen is very unstable and can be make you a bit dizzy. So I try to set 2 output paths, use 2 animated virtual cameras and let them work together to complete the whole narrative at the same time. When the visitor visiting the VR videos through the VR glasses, and in the exhibition on-site, the visitors still can see experimental videos, but with same storyline. So I think, because I always consider how to show my work in a combine the context of my videos together, and so whether in the physical or virtual worlds, they all can. I hope they can immerse themselves inside of the context with a more stable perspective, and that's and the next piece is a digital loser with which I will perform tonight with another Chinese artist, Zhi Ping. I think he will come soon, but and our first collaboration because of a performance opportunity, and we were in same professor's class, and at that time Berlin was also still during the lockdown, so expect for the performance and no audience. The performance was basically presented also for the live streaming, and it's also because such a special situation that we hit it off with such of our work at that time due to the complete closure of real life, and more parts of the life were digitalized, but in real life, your body seems to be bound. We also want to use a name called Digital Loser to reflect this situation. And in this area, people are popular on internet, maybe just a digital perpetual motion machine sitting at a table in the reality, and everyone seems to be stuck in the digital prison. So we came up this idea. And as digital artists, we active every day online in the online meeting digital space and between various windows on the desktop. So it's just exactly what's happening now, and we contribute our physical bodies to the unlimited cyber world, and the virtual body swing in the boundless space, which in real life there is actually only a computer screen in front of them, and we combined our daily work flow with our virtual avatar in the game engine, and presenting the process of making the artwork as the artwork itself to the audience. So it's the work I showed before kind of not like completely finished. But this work, I'm more want to show the work looks like how the work looks like before it became to be a work. So it's actually the most familiar screen scene for digital art for the digital artists. And in this interactive part is use OSC controllers from Unity, and he use Ableton Live, and we do some interaction with our avatar bodies. And I think I won't show it more. Maybe tonight you can see the whole things all together. Yeah. And yes, I think I'm going to finish my presentation, and thanks for watching. If you wanna see more my works, you can check on my website, and thanks for coming again. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm here to ask a few questions and relate. Are there any questions here in the crowd? So, Meng-Chuan, I see you use a lot of different tools in your setup. You do interface design, you do the world building in the game engines. Could you, and also the storytelling, could you explain a bit more into how you work? Like, what's the process? What comes first? And
oh yeah, I have my work process is as first of all, of course, you're interested in some part, like because we surfing every day, so I got so many informations, and I'm also super into the social media, so they inspired me a lot. And when some tiny ideas came into my brain, I start to write down them, and I do more research on it. And also about the storyline, I call it a storyline, but sometimes there's actually no logic there, but I just write the sentence can connect with each other, and slowly I will search some elements for my videos, can combine the text all together. And also, I think the conversation between me and my friends, and or maybe the people who I met, is also important for my work. And I really like to set different slogans on my video work. So the conversations were sometimes really became a slogan, like what in my previous work there was the Second Nature virtual company, which I said introduced before, and there's a slogan for this company called sell the past to the future. So I think it's applied for all the advisors, because if you look back to the all the pieces in the museum, and you will see actually all the concept which they promote now actually is already exist so many years ago. Like it's we always in a circles to, but with this same concept generated different ideas, and my process basically like real workflow is based on the game engine. So it's beside you thinking of the concept, you also have to do more real practice to real do something inside of this game engine and to see how it looks like. So it's always come all together. So many details.
And how many darlings that you had to kill in the end? Well, maybe let me pose a different question. Any more questions here? I was interested to learn, like you came from China to Berlin. Like for how long did you study in Berlin, and for how long have you been living here in Europe, and how was that transition?
I've been in Berlin for 6 years. I studied there for 4 years, and at WDK, I studied Kunstmedien, and how it. That's a good question. I haven't think about that.
Yeah, for example, you were talking about the Alipay thing. And I think for me, my personal, if we go to Berlin, I think we are very, also here in the Netherlands, also used to pay with cards.
Yes, still now.
And then you go there.
Still now, yes. Because actually this question is maybe 3 years ago is easy for me, but now it's hard for me to answer because I haven't been back China for almost 3 years since pandemic. So that's also, how can I say? I also really curious what happened in China now. I have same questions actually, but if the before, Berlin definitely, like the study life in Berlin changed me a lot. Before, like how I create my works, I think not. Before maybe I prefer like just personal thinking. I prefer work alone, but after I came to Berlin, and I think the communication became an important part of my creative process, and I would like to do more collaborations with different artists or different fields. I'm more open than before.
Nice. Yeah, I think there's also some interesting element in your bio. You say that together with Ziping, you're part of the Society for Non-Trivial Pursuits. Yes. And yeah, you want to play the concept of sound and visual to interpret the Sino-futurism understanding of the millennials. Could you elaborate a bit more what Sino-futurism entails? For you, and also maybe reflect on what neo-romantic elements, what do they mean for you?
And yes, and this the events comes from my class. We also have a performance group, and mm, I call my work like a neo-futurism, because like futurism is an old concept, and I wanna to create a new word for it, and the post-internet is kind of an old concept behind. So the neo, I think, is a really nice word, because there's a video game company in Japan called Neo Geo. Maybe I'm not sure if you know it. Yeah. So and neo is kind of to. I think this word already has some video game color inside, and when I just saw this word, I just think, yeah, that's this new word. Neo is really fits my visuals altogether. Yeah, that's why I call it like this.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you're so entangled between the virtual and the physical. To me, I'm not. Yeah, I'm a bit more old-fashioned, so I think it's really interesting to think of your visions of the future. To me, sometimes they feel a bit dystopic, but at the same, like trying to sell yourself into like an immortal database. But I think you do present that in that Taichu video as a I think it's a very beautiful film, and it's a very therapeutic vibe. It's very nice. Are there any other startups that you envision in your works that are not there yet?
Not yet. I think from this year I'm more. Before I always want to simulate other things like between virtual and reality, but this year I'm more like wanna bring more things from my virtual work to the physical world, to use more maybe 3D printer things and combined kinetic mechanical installations, and to show a physical, I don't know, creators. Combine my video installations all together. That's the direction I'm more interested in to the future. Yeah.
Nice. You also mentioned that you use Super Collider in one of your performances.
Only
Could
that
you-
one.
Could you talk a bit more about your experience with coding?
Actually, I have only a bit experience on coding. I'm not a programmer people. And I use Super Collider for this performance just because I need it. And for me, I think all the softwares and the tools is just like tools or a toy for me, because I study art, not technology. So I only use the part I need from this software, and it's like it's really easy. Is it logic? Like if you got a toy, you always wanna know how to play with it, and the best thing is like they always upgrade the toy for you. So we are so lucky as a digital artist. There are so many things we could explore, and the most important thing for us is maybe try to use the toy, like to play this toy not in a right way. Don't need to say any menu papers. Just try with yourself. I think, yeah, that's great.
Any more questions here? Maybe I got like one more question. I was interested. You shared a few sources of inspiration, some of the comics and other works, and I was interested. Like, could you share? Do you also have other Chinese popular culture elements that inspire your work and that could be interesting for us to look into, to be inspired by?
Chinese pop culture. Uh, yes, like pop culture, and actually, at when I was a teenager, the Japanese anime and K-pop influenced a lot, like children, like young people, and especially 2000 to 2010, these 10 years, that culture actually influenced a lot, and yeah, and also influenced Chinese pop culture a lot, I think. Mm. Mm. Well, but
Yeah, no, well,
I just
I,
thinking
other
back
any
to,
other source of inspiration is fine, but otherwise,
yeah,
thank you for your talk, thank you for your
yeah,
presentation.
thanks. But sorry, I'm
Ah.
thinking back things. Sorry, I'm so very delayed. Like actually um, the internet, like block internet in China, I really go through with that time. Like maybe before 2010, we still can use Facebook, Twitter, everything. Actually, we have Instagram in China, and but like in 2011 or 12, and we suddenly can't open it anymore. So I think that's a really important moment for me to realize, oh, we live in different cyberspace actually, yeah. And not, but now I think it's completely different. So like maybe the new generation in China, they don't even know that, but I knew the change. So that also influenced me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is very interesting to continue actually on this
Sorry.
conversation. But I think we have to wrap up for now. So thanks a lot for your presentation, and I'm really looking forward for your performance tonight. And yeah, thank you. We have a short break, and then the next speaker will. So we have 15 minutes, but give her an applause, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, it's not. Thanks. Yeah. Plus, like luckily it's online, and then we don't have the light, so basically if you have your talk online, you can still see it properly. And then yeah, like over Itachi works online. Yeah. Yeah, we presented it 2 years ago, right? Yeah.
Hello, thank you. Okay, is it? Yeah, super, thank you. Okay, so very quickly, just to contextualize a little bit. Oh wait, no, you're right. Thank you. Thanks. So this is really much a work in progress. So this is, right now we are four, myself, Brendan, and Dusan Barok and Vil Matthias Ekila, who, by the way, is the person who originally coined the term permacomputing. We are starting to working on writing about the relationship between this concept of permacomputing and aesthetics theory. So this is very much like a very, very early preview of our half-baked, thoughts on the topic, and hopefully, it's something that we'll be able to publish more extensively in the coming month. So permacomputing. So what is it? So in a sense, it's a new concept, and it's a community of practice that is inspired by permaculture. And permaculture, in case you're not aware of, it's basically an approach to land management and construction of human communities that adopt a natural ecosystem. So by making a connection between computer tech and permaculture, in fact, it's a bit of a provocation. It's almost as if we are trying to ask whether or not there can be a place for computer and network technology in a world where humans contribute to the well-being of the biosphere instead of destroying it. And if yes, how can this be achieved? So at the moment, permacomputing is both a set of design principles and a way to make cultural works in a more sustainable way. So why talk about aesthetics in this context? First of all, we are within the context of creative coding festivals, so I guess it's a good opportunity to talk about aesthetics. But it's also, in our presentation, a way to talk about aesthetics from a perspective of how we are looking at things, not just how things are looking. And how to deal with the fact that we are always implicated in the object that we try to criticize, or that we build ourselves or try to engage with. So ultimately, what we would like permacomputing to be is a sort of materialization of real and recognizable useful form of degrowth and other concepts orthogonal to capitalist growth and market organization. So somehow it's a bit of a counter voice to the digital aesthetics that promote maximization, such as a high bandwidth, high resolution, more computational power at any cost for doing anything all the time, everywhere. Of course, our perspective is completely partial and biased. So we are completely aware, but also bothered by the narrow cultural basis brought forward by those who get to define the aesthetics. So, for instance, to just be very, very explicit, it's the perspective of the white Western heterosexual male, and we're going to loop back to that a bit later. So now, what is it that brings us together today? Well, for the people who are involved in the permacomputing project, it's essentially artists and hackers who are familiar enough with computer network technology and who are, they're just fed up with the state of computational culture. They're fed up with how the field of art and culture production has engaged with computer tech criticism. And it's just a sort of ongoing question for ourselves. If the question of sustainability and also environmentalism can be more than translated into formal aesthetics when it reaches the cultural sectors.
Okay, so here I'm going to maybe try to, it's a little bit risky to define things in terms of the negative, but maybe to define something that we see as kind of the enemy or the thing that we don't want. So we could say that we live in a time of sort of maximalist techno-aesthetics that have been more or less perverted by this myth that it's fine to have eternal growth, number just keep going up, everything's great, and resources are essentially infinite. And I think we all know that that's not a healthy long-term way of seeing things. And so the aesthetics generally tend to reflect, they don't reflect any notion of limits and limitations. And so one thing we don't mean, though, is maximalism in terms of artistic practices. There are certain like painters and novelists who use this sort of maximalist aesthetic where they're like super dense aesthetics. We don't have any opposition. In fact, some of those things could actually fit into some of the things we're talking about here. But what we mean is more of an aesthetics that becomes synonymous with these sort of tech demos that you see that are constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible. It's basically about showing off that this is the new features of the new thing, and pushing the limit of that, and anything that was from last year or 3 or 4 years ago is already embarrassing because it has fewer polygons or something like that. So what we're seeing then as this sort of stuff that we are very problematic and represent this maximalist view are things like photorealism, super high resolution and super high bandwidth media. Also the bandwidth increases that you see in social media, so you have things went from text to then image-based posts to then video posts, or you had textual like chat stuff also went from these really low bandwidth chat systems earlier to now things where people expect to constantly be sending images and videos back and forth. You also have machine learning models, which are huge and require, just to hold the model, you might need gigantic computing resources, things like that. And people walk around with essentially things which used to be called supercomputers, but it's in your pocket. And it seems kind of incredible that you would have this level of resources, but you're just, I don't know, maybe looking at cat pictures or something. There's a messed up irony to that. The other thing is, I kind of argue that these aesthetics, like if you look at this image here, there's no sign of any actual biology. There's no sign of any life. There's no space for sweat or hair or food. You know, I make this metaphor sometimes. I say like, yeah, in the future nobody shits, because there's this idea that the future is about this sort of perfect, clean, completely artificial world where there's no more actual bodies, there's no more life, there's no more, I don't know, mushrooms or dirt or sleep or losing your hair or anything that's sort of normal everyday life for any of us. And so this is an aesthetics that's promoted by this kind of techno-maximalist culture of a sort of seamless design, and it also dovetails into sort of shopping and car culture and these sort of very rubberized virtual worlds, the cloud, consciousness downloading, transhumanism, freezing your brain so that in the future they can put it into a robot body. Some of these ideas may seem a bit radical, but for a lot of people who are working in some of the companies that make this stuff, those things all fit together in a sort of normal logic of the way things are going to turn out. Mars colonies, where you can go to a new planet and start over. You don't have all these filthy streets or trees or things which are messy and get in the way. You can start off and make everything out of metal and plastic, and it'll be tidy. There's also this problem that these aesthetics tend to push, because they tend to be based on standardization, and they push a sort of hypernormativity. So I don't know if any of you remember this. This was in the aughts when the Mac was sort of starting to usurp the dominance of the PC world. Then Apple made this campaign, but these are both two white guys who are, in a way, I felt like this was I've called it the battle for digital whiteness. Anyway, but these things tend to be kind of pushing a normative standard that everyone else, the entire world, should have to subscribe to. So that, in a sense, you could say that here's the Apple headquarters, which is pitched as this sort of UFO that comes from space. But if you look at the other side here, that's Cupertino, and that's what it is this sprawling shopping malls with these chain stores, and everyone drives cars. And it's an idea that when you standardize the interface for the whole world, that this is sort of the way they think everyone should live. At least you could, I would make that case. Maybe it's not true, but... and then there's a lot of stuff where simple things are made complicated. So here's the inside of a machine for a startup that got tens of millions to make a juicer that required an app and lots of APIs and stuff. And it turned out that you could do the same thing by just pouring yourself a glass of juice or squeezing the bag. And you didn't need any of this super complicated systems to just put juice in a glass. And so it's sort of emblematic of these kinds of things. And then, of course, I mean, I don't think I need to lecture. I think we're all aware of these problems of consumerism, that you buy things, you buy a digital device and you throw it away a couple of years later, and it produces these sort of huge amounts of e-waste. It produces a lot of pollution and a lot of also social inequality among the people who have to then clean this stuff up. So to come back to this questions of aesthetics, so there's a materiality, and then there's a sort of idea that if you acknowledge that things are limited, that we have constraints, this is fundamental to, say, biology, design, economics, like all of these different fields acknowledge that there's constraints, there's limits to things. And so, you know, and this is also our everyday life, you know, that I had to deal with the fact that the train that I wanted to catch went by, you know, these sort of normal things. Everyone deals with constraints in a certain way. And in some ways, we see them often in a negative light, and that we see that technology should then be getting rid of these things for us. But in some ways, that these constraints, that this idea then is that limitations are opposed to this capitalist ideology that are constantly selling us a freedom by removing these things. So if you buy a new product, then it's fetishizing this accumulation, that you buy more stuff and that will give you more freedom, but then these things are based on these strategies of exploiting and extracting resources that are very damaging to the environment. And so we see that maybe constraints could be something that you could actually enjoy or appreciate as a healthy limits. And so if you can make these things more visible and part of the aesthetics, then that might be a place to start incorporating those things in everyday life. And it would be a way of resisting this sort of techno-maximalist stuff as the only way to deal with our problems in everyday life. And so we're trying to position permacomputing aesthetics as embracing these kind of limitations and constraints, and to make them visible, to not pretend that they're not there. So this is also, you know, because it's something we all deal with, these constraints in everyday life, and that's also something that defines a lot of artists and craft people, that they're always working with constraints, whether they're material or otherwise. And so here are a few examples, which Emmerich is going to try and go through.
So yeah, I'm going to go through very quickly to some example of constraints. So we can see constraints in alternative media distribution. So here this is a snapshot of, a photo from an installation that document ephemeral media circulation in Cuba. Still in Cuba, there is TeamSpeak, which is a software that has been becoming the backbone of SNET, which is a sort of alternative of the internet that was running for Cuba for a long time in online gaming community. Also, if you look back you can also see like constraints in the sense of political conditions. So this is a screenshot from Original Video Journal, which is a late 80s dissident video magazine edited and copied secretly on school equipment in Czechoslovakia. Constraint could also be basically like the byproduct of working under a restrictive copyright regime. So for instance, if you go to the UbiWeb archive, one of the reasons why this archive of film and video is still existing is because it is a lot of low-res material and it's distributed in a such, let's say, like rather anachronistic way compared to today's media technology. Constraint can also be purely socio-economic in the sense of working in poverty, basically. So the Russian and Soviet constructivists using wood and scrap metal because other art supplies were scarce are also a form of constraint. And then you have let's say like the classic DIY tech creativity as portrayed in poverty that is often shown in mainstream media every now and then as a sort of a twisted ode to creativity in the global south. But you also have artists recycling themselves, so making use of discarded material to quickly produce their work in an inexpensive way. And then you have formal constraint, which is usually the way constraints are understood into art and design, which is self-imposed or limited by technology. And that was used a lot by early computer artists working out algorithms for plotters, for instance, without screens. Then you have also art movement like Arte Povera in Italy from the late 60s. So it's a movement that was born in an open polemic with traditional art, whose techniques and supports it rejects in order to resort precisely to poor materials such as earth, wood, iron, plastic, and industrial waste. You have constraint in literature again. So this is an example with the Oulipo, the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, which is a writer collective. And this is a famous novel from Georges Perec called La Disparition, where the letter E has been completely removed. It's not present at all in the whole story. And then you have things such as typewriter art, which is sort of this weird cousin of ASCII art in some way. And obviously, software is a domain of constraints, software-based art. And here's a screenshot of a demo scene, of a demo from a subset of the demo scene that is specialized in making 4K intros. And by 4K, I don't mean that this is a 4K resolution. That means that the software that generates this animation is 4 kilobytes. Then you also have constraints related to materials. So an example here with Enzo Mari, with the Auto Progettazione, which is a technique to make furniture only with common size construction wood. Another example of furniture based on found industrial materials. And you have this sort of weird thing as well, such as this rustic furniture example using saplings, bits of firewood, driftwood, scraps, old tools, handles. So you get the point. I think I don't need to put more example. The relationship between constraint and creativity has a very, very rich history, whether it is self-imposed, inflicted by external factors, or so on and so forth. But we will get back to the nature of this later on. So, and this is where there is an interesting contradiction that we think is emerging from this statement, is that constraints do generate a lot of diversity. And so it's a little bit strange because while they give this idea of constraining things, in fact, they expand the narrow cultural scale of the present time. And it's interesting because there is indeed a strong connection between cultural diversity and constraint. On the other hand, cultural uniformity is the mechanic oil that keeps the capitalist and neoliberal machine running. And corporate capitalism, in particular, relies heavily on hegemonic ethnocentrism, cultural assimilation, and cultural appropriation to be the most efficient and productive. So produced under such conditions, computer aesthetics are obviously affected and will always struggle to escape the fate of computational culture that only mimic and reinforce dominant forms of organization. And a good example is interface, software interface, which in the past years have been increasingly a demonstration of almost like a neo-colonial project, in the sense that they are designed to steamroll the look and feel of everyday life and to standardize our relation to the world at the service of massive hegemonic tech companies. So in a way, drifting from this idea of going back to weird interfaces, like how do we reintroduce critical weirdness in our practices, our computational practices? And we believe that diversity in computing should be celebrated like diversity in food, in clothing, in architecture, in music and craft, because it's an important counter-hegemonic action. And by celebrating unconventional interfaces, we hope to be able to resist the normative forces symbolically, but also via cultural diffusions of these very practices. And maybe for us, the first step to introduce critical weirdness in computational culture could be as simple as, let's say, embracing the plethora of underlying constraints that are readily available and found in software code, procedurability, and interaction. So, of course, limits are arbitrary. So, if you've been following so far, you could have found like a loophole in this reasoning, which is to say that the latest GPU also has limits, within which a creative coder needs to work with as well. So where do where is the threshold? And this is why permacomputing maybe tries to add a little footnote to this question of constraint, because it stands apart from more creative approach to making visible and use constraint in the way it tries to connect with specific material and environmental constraints. So permacomputing, in that sense, uses material constraint to reflect its environmental and cultural value. It could be things such as working with e-waste, but also taking into account the limited availability of hardware and energy, but also thinking in terms of computational devices, almost like heirloom objects, taking into account also like the working with natural material to try to depart from the only working with plastic, and also take on board the question of how to repair and design for descent and longevity, and as well to reflect local and cultural, regional, subcultural aesthetic and material. And now we're going to have a few examples of permacomputing projects.
Okay, I'm going to kind of blast through these because it's a little tight on time. But yeah, if you have questions about if I haven't done a good job explaining these, then you can talk to us in the break and we can explain. Okay, if we go over a few minutes, we're okay. Okay, all right. So this one is called it's Gemini. So somebody basically said like, well, what if we started over? Maybe the web has become too big and bloated. If we started over and we made a super minimalist protocol that acted like the web did in the early 90s. And so they came up with this thing called Gemini, which doesn't even allow you to use images. I mean, you can have a link to an image, but you can't have an image integrated in it. And so you have actually kind of an interesting small scene of people who adapted this and were able to make sites very quickly and link to each other. And it's kind of a parallel web in a way. This is one called Uxen, which is from 100 Rabbits, which is actually, I guess, a duo who work on, are interested in permacomputing, and they wanted to make games, especially, also apps, and they basically came up with a virtual machine which acts like an 8-bit computer from the sort of Nintendo era. And they came up with this simple instruction set, and a kind of community has started to emerge around it, and they've ported it to like, you can even run it on like a Nintendo DS and some of these, or old PCs and things like that, but you can also run it on a modern PC using an emulator. And so there's a bunch of people who are then targeting this platform, which is sort of lo-fi, but relatively approachable. This one is from Emeric and some other people. It's a game called What Remains, and so they made a new Nintendo, so the original Famicom NES, first generation Nintendo, but it's with current themes, and then they even were able to recycle old Nintendo cartridges to put the game on it, and so yeah, Emeric can tell you more about it later. This is a project of mine. It's called the Screenless Office, and so what I do is I try to see how far I could go through my day without using a screen. So, I mean, I could go on a long time about this, but if I can pass around. So the idea is that it's sort of, a lot of the interaction is based on print. So I have a laser printer and then a barcode scanner, and so I'll scan different things. So in the morning, I'll scan something, and it prints out sort of like a newspaper. It grabs a bunch of feeds, and then each of the headlines and has like a little barcode under it. So if I actually want to read the article, then I click on or scan that, and then that will print out. And anyway, if you're interested, I can talk more about it later. This was a concept that Michael Klodner is working on. It was a sort of garden library network of these sort of nodes that would be either located in gardens and would provide both some physical infrastructure, but also would have, and the idea was that they didn't need to be connected to the internet, that you could sort of like look things up locally or get different bits of information by just either physically interacting with it or by using some device that would connect to a Wi-Fi that was in the box. And now there's a few more that we find super interesting, but they don't necessarily, or we don't want to make them official certified PMC things, but we feel that they have a lot of crossover, that they relate well to the ideas that we're interested in. And so this is from Martin Howes, who was doing a bunch of experiments with what he called an Earth computer, and also he talked about life coding. And so the idea was that he built these sort of installation/performance systems where he would integrate fungus or worms or different actual living things in the circuits that he was building to make sound and produce these. It was also modulating lasers and things like that. Then another one, which is kind of interesting, there's been a bunch of small file festivals. So there was I think it was in British Columbia somewhere, there was this small file film festival, and the idea was that they had a maximum size, which was pretty low, and maximum resolution. So people had to then come up with really interesting, weird ideas for how to make their movie fit into this format. There's some similar ones going on right now, I think at the Photographers Gallery with, but it's for photography then, still images. This one's pretty interesting. This is Robert Henke, who's a, I believe, German artist who lives in Berlin, and he made this sort of what we would think of as a very maximalist presentation format, but he's using 1980s Commodores. You can see the PCs down here. These are like original 8-bit PCs that he's then hacked and used very low-tech means to make this super real-time, quite intense presentation that I think makes a good case that you don't need the latest and greatest NVIDIA stuff to work in this kind of format. Here's another project which is quite interesting that's called the MNT Reform. So it's somebody who's trying to make a laptop which is completely open hardware and open source, but also that it's fully documented and very hackable and modular, so that you can turn it over, take the screws out, and replace the CPU or replace the RAM, or that it's it's very nerd-oriented, but it has this openness that implies that it can work for a long time if you keep sort of maintaining it in different ways. Some other scenes, there's been a lot of people who are really interested in working with different older print technologies that are either digital or can be made to work with digital things. So here, this was a video game that Joachim, what's his last name? What is it? Zef? Josef, yeah. But what's his last name? Okay. All right, I'm very sorry. I apologize if he's watching this right now. Anyway, this was a game that worked on a pen plotter. So pen plotters are these machines that, especially architects, but a lot of, in some ways before laser printers and things were commonplace, they were typical for higher end graphic output. But it would use an actual pen that was controlled by this sort of robot arm that would then draw the vector images. And so he made a game that ran on the pen so that you would actually play in real time and it would draw the sort of, it was basically Snake, if you remember the old Snake game on the... Anyway, but there's a lot of people doing different experimental stuff, making zines with old print technologies and making posters with plotters and things like that. And they've, basically adapted these machines that industry is no longer interested in using, and you can get them sometimes free or cheap from architects who are retiring and things like that. There's a very similar, I would think, interesting crossover that's going on with textile work. So textiles, okay, we gotta speed up here. I won't go deep into it, but there's a lot of really interesting crossover with that, with hacking old machines and making them work with new digital hybrids. And the last one here, this one is, we just kind of really have a sentimental thing. This is a picture of a car repair shop in Poland where they still use a Commodore 64, which is like 35, 40 years old. They still use it every day to do their invoices and basic stuff because they say, well, it works and there's no reason to stop using it. Okay, so now Aymerique's going to talk about nostalgia.
Yeah, so following these examples and given the focus of permacomputing, I mean, in the way that it doesn't, hesitate into using old technology, there is a risk to misunderstand permacomputing with retrocomputing, and retroaesthetics. But no. So is it really about nostalgia? These things that we are talking about. The things that in a world which is vastly dominated by technological novelty, linear economy, and technolationism, our relationship to time is hard to decouple from consumerism. So if you keep this in mind, then you have this relation to time is also not ours because it's the one that is constantly defined by the industries and economic cycles. So our short lifespan, our short attention span benefit a productive apparatus that favors obsolescence, neophilia, amnesia, and non-historicity. So the result is that framing all usage of dated things become nostalgic because they have exhausted their time of maximal economic value. So in a context where consumerism is what defines our identity, it means that dated things can only relate to a past self. So in that sense, retrocomputers and retroaesthetics are essentially restorative nostalgia because they allow a connection with a past self through objects of mass consumption. They favor what we could say like a cult of simpler times, like the good old days where things were simpler. I'm going to pick up my old console and play a good old Mario because then I remember my childhood and things were much easier. And but obviously it's a trap. It's a complete trap because through the well-meaning intention of creating, let's say, a safe space for emulating lost youth and this kind of, fields, Instead, it fosters a deep conservative thinking and that fetishizes the past that in fact never was. So if anything, it prevents the problematization of what was already a defective computational culture back then. And to give like a quick example of also this problem specifically inherent to computational culture that we don't find or way less in music, music instrument. So when you had the Jamaican sound studios that started to experiment in the 70s with obsolete and abandoned US audio equipment like spring reverbs and first generation of tape delays and mixers, they were not nostalgic about 60s surf music that they wanted to replicate. No, they just had access to this. That was the context, the constraint of their practice. And so they used these effects and these objects of sound production and sound effect that were attached to a specific, let's say, cultural context. And they made something completely different with that, which eventually led to the creation of dub music, for instance, which has nothing to do with surf music. So permacomputing sees computational devices in the same way, like many different instruments that potentially are just waiting to be rediscovered and reappropriated. And most importantly, it belongs to a much wider range of post-digital aesthetics, which is a concept that we find much more useful than nostalgia. So in the 90s, you had this meme of digitality, this idea of let's say, that everything is going to be digital, it's a digital revolution, it's going to be awesome, and it was basically what paved the way towards maximalism, narrow culture basis, and basically neophilia in tech. However, let's say like the more recent concept of post-digital aesthetics brings to light the end of such new media cult. That suddenly we eventually entered a phase where there was a new form of articulation between new and old media, and then this competition between these two things started to become increasingly irrelevant. And as a result, permacomputing sees itself definitely quite post-digital in the sense that I would say from the asynchronous but always connected life, the mediation of our social interaction that deeply affects our natural rhythm and flows. So in a way, we try to resist the exhaustion of everything, the exhaustion of energies, of natural resources, of ecosystem, of life here and elsewhere. Then exhaustion that is basically comes at our own cost, but also the cost of others who did not ask anything to start with. And so, no, it's really not nostalgia. It's really about signposting social cultural regression that we find increasingly problematic and alarming. So to wrap up, again, permacomputing is new. It's new, but it's also old in the sense that it really ties to a whole long tradition of critique of computer technology that was already quite vivid and sharp back in the 50s and the 60s. But there was also like many issues that some of us in this community are currently trying to figure out and reflect upon. And I'm just going to give two. The first one is that while we are able to frame positively, like I just did, permacomputing through the lens of post-digital aesthetics, it's also a potential trap as well, because it also has the risk of obfuscating the sort of increasing dependence on new technology. And to give a very concrete example, if you look at the retrocomputing modding scene, that kind of cherish the constant maintenance and development of new, let's say no, not of new, of old computer, and they make them relevant by putting them online, by adding stuff, by modding hardware. This thing is framed as something somehow different. However, it can only exist in the whole system of production of modern technology that allows for the rapid prototyping and production of PCBs, of electronics, and all the classic supply chain. So there is a risk with post-digital aesthetics that it also obfuscate, let's say like a very problematic symbiosis with the very system it tries to provide the critique for. And there is also an even bigger issue, which is whether or not permacomputing can be truly transitional or transformative, and not just symptomatic of just living and making art in the Western ruins of capitalism. Because if we look at making art and design, it's essentially, and it's still rooted, it's still something that cannot be decoupled from the question of classes and privileges. So while permacomputing aesthetics and the lifestyle it aims to encourage may feel affiliated to let's say, to grassroots DIY activism that you could see, for instance, in Brazilian cultural practices such as Gambiarra and Mutiaro, it is nothing like that, because in the global north, an alternative lifestyle and practice, let alone the possibility to remove yourself temporarily from productivist and extractive and exploitative system, is a sign of privilege. And it remains inaccessible for the vast majority. So therefore, we also see that there is a danger for permacomputing or permacomputing aesthetics or things that could relate to permacomputing, that it remains just formal aesthetics. So looping back to the beginning of the presentation and heavily relying on style appropriation of practices for which the urgency and its constraints are life imperatives and not a creative choice. So that doesn't mean, it's not an excuse to embrace extractivism and wasteful practices, of course, but it means that we are walking on thin ice. And it still needs a lot of work on understanding the situatedness of permacomputing to avoid a situation where it ends up as basically like a hobby for the most privileged people, like low-tech practices, which is increasingly a hobby in Western Europe and North America. Or, on the other hand, end up as a kind of a romanticization and aestheticization of poverty. So that's what we're trying to do right now, and it's complicated, but it's also fun and, nice to try to do something. If you want to join us in this quest, existential quest, we have a wiki that you can find on permacomputing.net. We also have a mailing list, an IRC channel, and we use the permacomputing hashtag on the Fediverse to talk about all these things. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. All the amazing examples. I have a question, but I first want to look at the room. Does somebody has a question? Please come. Yeah,
so, in a way, you're trying to permacomputing with, in time itself, like in our society, computers are evolving, so also the materials you will have, even if it's from 50 years ago, it's still evolving. So, how do you avoid that even permacomputing itself is evolving? Essentially because the types reusing materials are also still evolving.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So very quickly, so there is a very easy answer. Well, it's easy. What? Oh, sorry. Oh, yes.
Please repeat it.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so for the recording. I repeat so how do we avoid basically the fact that we are in a landscape that also technologically speaking is evolving? So how can we preserve some sort of sense in the way that we want to still working with technology in a different way? So, sorry, this is the way we are doing it right now is that we try to have these two parallel threads. One is to work with design principles. So if you go to the wiki, there are permacomputing design principles that are derived from the permaculture design principles and that are there to inform the design of new objects. So if you're put into the situation that you need to develop new tech, new hardware or new software, there are design principles that try to, let's say, limit the damages from our perspective. So that's the threat one. And the threat two is the more, let's say, more common to the example that we showed, is to encourage working with a direct environment. So if you need to develop a new application, a new art project, a new work of design that involve existing computer tech, really look what is already available immediately around you that could be repurposed, reused, bought secondhand, and so on and so forth. So that's the way we're trying to tackle this sort of constantly shifting territory.
Thanks. So there was a question online. People were wondering, how do you work together from a distance?
Yes, so we're using mostly mailing lists and IRC. And IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat, which is a quite old text-based, let's say, chat software. For few moments, we did use, because I can see where this person is going, we used video chat conference for some project where it was just more practical, but most of the thing that we are doing, we try to, to basically do dog fooding, to not to practice what we preach. And I can say that this whole presentation, for instance, also the concept, the discussion around it has been done only through IRC. I mean, people have been able to work and publish academic paper as well before Jitsi and Zoom, so it's not so hard.
Another question? Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's what it is, that it, at least...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. So the question was that if you're, in some ways we become accustomed to particular digital ways of behaving, and that we become then dependent, I guess. Is that what you're saying? And that you don't know how does that relate to permacomputing? If somehow a new need is introduced that requires a new system, a new technological system, then how can you do that? How can you still? And so I guess some of it is about provoking the question. So do you really need Google Maps then? I mean, some people, they become dependent on it and they can't imagine it. But you could try to go without, and you could try to come up with another solution. You could, I mean, I'll tell you what I do. Because I don't want to get too much into this personal biography stuff, but I printed, like to come here today, I had a printed map. I printed out from OpenStreetMaps the image of Utrecht that had this main station in here on it, and I was able to deal with missing a bus and then having to walk most of the way here, and it was fine. So I think it's very situational. I mean, it's something you have to negotiate, but I think there's a lot of things where once you become accustomed to a way of doing something that is somehow convenient, then it destroys your imagination for another way of doing it. And that's what we're trying to do here, is provoke the idea that you could have imagination for other ways of doing these things. And maybe it turns out that they are too labor intensive, or too, only people who are really privileged can do that, but it's worth trying or thinking about. I don't know if you wanted to.
And also the fact that, there is a different speed of evolution in terms of information technology. But yeah, there is a question of choice. Do we actually want this type of evolution? But it's also not resisting this evolution. It's also to say like what kind of path or forks are we going to take. And so if you go back to the question of permaculture and just the culture of permaculture, because that was also the idea behind permaculture to take into account human culture in the process. Cultural diffusion is also something that is going super, super fast. So I think it's not a question of speed or catching up with things that is a problem here. Is that we don't necessarily have our say in their development, and that the kind of fork and path we've been taking so far are getting increasingly bleak.
Could you also explain, like how would you want to create a kind of systemic change with permacomputing project? Where where do you know? But who do you want to? Who's the first target audience that should engage with this?
Everyone. But no, but there's a simple question I think that could be worth for everyone, and that is very much related to permacomputing, in my opinion, is the question of computational worth. Like how can we put a value on a computational action? So when we press on a button, when you render something, when you are behind your computer and you're being funny with your WALL-E prompt or whatever, or DALL-E, sorry, not WALL-E. But there is a computational cost to that. This computational cost has an energetical footnote. It has a consequence in terms of what kind of extractivist resources have been put into motion to get to this point. So how do we try to be a bit more conscious that this is not innocent? Any kind of interaction with a computational culture is essentially extractivist. There will never be sustainable IT, there will never be green IT, so how do we try to get a bit more conscious about that? We don't see it because it's hidden. It's hidden somewhere, it's hidden in different forms, and it's usually quite far from the site of execution. So, that's I think why we get all tricked into this.
Thanks. I think we'll conclude it with this. Super clear to me. We have a short break because we have to introduce the next speaker. So thanks a lot. Thanks.
In Cambridge.
1, 2, 3. Ja, het is als we het programma aanhouden, gaan we gewoon nu... ja. Jezus, zo licht. Het is... Ah ja. Het is zo online, hè? De talk. Ja, gaan we... Sorry. Nee, we zijn even een terugleven. Okay, so we'll continue with the last speaker. It's Mindy Su. She'll be present online. Mindy Su is a designer and technologist based in New York City. She's currently teaching as an assistant professor at Rutgers Mason Gross School of the Arts and critic at Yale School of Art. Here she is. Her expanded practice involves archival projects, technocritical writing, performative lectures, design commissions, and close collaborations. Mindy's ongoing Cyberfeminism Index, which gathers 3 decades of online activism and net art, was commissioned by Rhizome and presented at the New Museum in its online form, and its print form is a recipient of a Graham Foundation grant. Welcome, Mindy. I think, Mindy, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, check. I just introduced you, so you.
Oh, great.
Welcome.
So should I? Thank you.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, the sound just popped on for you all. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here remotely. I wish I could be there in person. And I'm going to be talking about 3 projects today, all using the browser. So I'm going to begin screen sharing. You might see yourselves for a moment. I'm going to minimize the screen. So here I have 3 browsers with 3 distinct projects. And I like using the browser because a lot of this work is web-based, so it feels natural to kind of use their original medium. But I'll be talking about each. The first one is the longest, and then I'll move into the other 2. Girls need modems. This gender changer figures out how a computer works, and she is not afraid of taking it apart. This glitch is a correction to the machine. So here you're getting a quick preview into the PDF of the final manuscript for the Cyberfeminism Index. I'm not going to be talking about the content of this project at length, but I will be giving a few examples of its container over time, focusing on the website and how we scripted it into a book, and also talking about some major themes. So another reason why I like using the browser is you can open up the inspector. So all of my notes are in HTML comments. If I don't read something or give the citation, com/sharing, and open up the inspector, you'll be able to see all the links and citations. So the first lecture as I saw was actually given by Emma Ray Brummel for the School for Poetic Computation. So you can view Emma's lecture at this GitHub link. I have long been a gatherer, And though we rarely hear this word used literally anymore, we do hear its sister, gathering. We're in a Zoom gathering today. But the term gatherer we more immediately associate with our origins as hunter-gatherers. We went, we gathered goods, and then we returned home to our kin. Some of the opening lines of a talk that I gave, or of an essay that I wrote for Shift Space, which was the inaugural publication for the Knight Foundation. And you can look at that link here for the full essay. This is followed by an excerpt from Ursula Le Guin, Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, this 1986 essay. This essay is really important because it basically reframes the history of technology. It posits that the first tool is not the spear, which is a tool of dominance, but in fact the basket, which is a tool of gathering. It also reframes our understanding of the protagonist away from the individual hero and towards a community. So it moves from a he to a we. So that felt quite apt for what I've been trying to do with this project, which not is a revisionist history of the internet, but also really focusing on the communal aspect of how people can co-author a text. So this page that we're on is part of a larger essay, and I'm not going to be talking through all these examples, but I will focus on the website itself. So the second container for this project was the website. So what you're looking at here is a page from the Talmud, which is the central religious and theological text of Judaism. So this center block is called the Mishnah. The columns surrounding this are comments from religious scholars on the Mishnah, and the outermost columns are commentary on the commentary. So built into the structure of the page, you have this dialectic of different voices. And this was actually an important reference for the development of the internet itself. So here we have a photo of Ted Nelson, who is considered the father of the concept of hypertext or hyperlinks, holding up a page from the Talmud as he talks about his proto-internet Xanadu. The Talmud was a core inspiration for hyperlinks because it showed that nothing was written itself, but also required a lot of references and citations from people that came before us, as well as people that are around us. The architecture supported this idea of a practice of citation for everyday life. So thinking about this, we really wanted this to be our first question when designing and coding the Cyberfeminism Index website. How do we visualize citations? It's also important to note that books and web are so complementary, and in fact, both can be coded. But in printed matter, cross-references, indexes, bibliographies, footnotes, these are all examples of analog hyperlinks. So here we have an image of a cat and hole icon from the Whole Earth Millennium Catalog. And here we're on page 70, but if we wanted to jump to a related theme, we could see something about restoration forestry on page 90. So this is Xanadu itself. This is what our internet could have been had we not used the World Wide Web, which was created by Sir Tim Berners-Lee in 1989. Xanadu, in many ways, feels similar to the World Wide Web. So in this center column, you have this long scrolling text. And I'm sure today we saw a lot of examples of websites and code that use an alternative form, but the majority of our websites online are pretty flat and vertically scrolling. What's unique about this is instead of having a link that's a blue underline, these links appear as these highlights and show the quotes from the original page in context. So if I linked to a secondary page, it would actually pull up that page as side notes for our primary text. Again, it's a way that Ted Nelson was thinking about visibly showing the citations and secondary voices that came in support of creating this new text rather than claiming singular authorship of this text itself. And this is an example of space. So Xanadu also was really thinking about how to add depth and motion and space into our browsers in the 1970s, 1980s. A lot of people at this time were also considering this same type of interactivity online, including Muriel Cooper at the MIT Media Lab. But here we still have these long scrolling pages, and anytime there's a link, it creates a visible connection to its original source on a secondary page. This was also a way to create two-way links. So currently, the World Wide Web uses one-way links, which means if I linked to the Iteration Symposium and 2 months from now that site goes down, the site on my page would lead to a 404. And that's what's called link rot or bit rot. But Xanadu was encouraging the use of bidirectional or two-way links, which means if I linked to a secondary page, it would actually create an archival snapshot of that page. So you actually had an architecture that was supporting citation. This is opposed to what we're familiar with now, where it's so easy to screenshot or link. But if that link goes down, or if we don't give attribution, we're able to because the current World Wide Web supports that kind of behavior. So alongside the question, how do we visualize citations? The second question for when building the cyberfeminismindex.com was, how do websites age? So here we see a 1997 net art piece by the artist Alexei Shulgin. And he's using a lot of bureaucratic form elements like buttons, text fields, drop-downs, etc. And rather than styling them, he just changes their location on the page. So by focusing on the composition, over time, 25 years later, using Rhizome's emulator, the site looks like this. A little blown out if you're using a projector, but we can see in many ways the similarities between the 1997 site and the 2021 site. So of course the screen is much higher resolution, but again, because he didn't style the web page itself and only focus on the composition, we still have a large concrete poetic title of buttons that create the title form. Clicking these text fields still leads to a series of pop-ups and animations. But the screen is much higher res, we have a white background, we have stronger drop shadows, rounded corners. And my collaborator, Angeline Meitzler, and I really liked this idea of how do we show the age of a website by incorporating a design that allows it to age as the browser updates. So we wanted to embrace this kind of style changes rather than creating a design that was so contained that it wasn't actually as flexible to grow in the browser as something like this. Another inspiration for us was the 100 anti. It's here. So again, this site was made in 1997 by the Old Boys Network, and it was creating 100 definitions as to what cyberfeminism was not, rather than focusing on an explicit definition of cyberfeminism. This website also works perfectly online today. So we can kind of guess to why that happened, whether it was intentional or not. So this site, made in 1997, uses only HTML and CSS. It's hard-coded. It doesn't use JavaScript, the now distinct Flash, or any third-party job. Using a lot of CSS defaults. So we have CSS Blue, Header 1, Header 2, and all of our list items. It's also using Arial, which is one of the only system fonts co-designed by a woman, Patricia Saunders for IBM in the early 1980s. And we also see things like this dropdown as their navigation. So this, when first sketching the site, this felt a little too similar to its reference, as well as too similar to spreadsheets themselves. So through multiple iteration, Angeline and I came up with this. So when you first arrive at cyberfeminismindex.com, that snaps to what appears to be a fairly standard table. But upon interacting with the site is made to feel unusual. So we have this breathing green blur that ebbs and flows depending on your scroll position. Every time you click an entry, it's added to the side panel, which we call the side panel trail, to create all of these associative links between your selections. And we also incorporate as many form elements as possible. So this dropdown, we've stretched to the full width of that container, but we also have several buttons at the bottom. What's interesting about this is when people take screenshots of this site, I'm able to tell what browser they're using depending on how these default elements appear. So in Firefox, which I use, the dropdown and here, and it has rounded corners. Whereas if I see this opened up in Chrome, it's actually a bit bigger and has angular corners like a rectangle. So it's exciting for us to see how this principle of how to incorporate browser updates and design into the design is already in effect. And we're curious to see how this site will age over the next 10, 20 years. To be online and design updated with the browser for as long as possible. And within each of the entries, we have these cross-references that push and pull you to different parts of the page. Again, encouraging this idea of nonlinear reading and internal citation container itself. And it's kind of hidden by this video bar, but at the bottom of the side panel, there are two buttons that say download and view all downloads as a PDF. And this is still the server side. So all of your selections, we do map who's downloaded or who anonymously has downloaded something and the quantity and the time, but we don't store your IP address and we don't store your selections. Okay, so to quickly wrap up this chapter and keeping an eye on time, I wanted to show you how we scripted this into the book itself. So we exported this entire website as a Google Sheet, and then we imported all of that into Google Docs because it's much easier to edit text in Google Docs. But you'll see that Google Docs naturally tags its text elements. So this is tagged as header 1. These understands that this is a numbered list. And we also then color-coded some of the individual entries themselves. So titles are red, metadata is green, annotations are in blue, and the excerpts themselves are black or just Roman. And in between these, we also have inline cross-references that are gray wrapped in parentheses. So I'll show you how we pulled that into our InDesign template using JavaScript and data merge. So Lily, the InDesign scripter we were working with, exported our Google Doc as an XML document. And then now we can see her downloading this, and she's going to upload it into a design created by Laura in InDesign. So Lily is pulling up the InDesign file right now, and she's going to import XML. And as she drags that into our InDesign document, you'll see that it auto tags based on what we've done above. So now we have this 2-column grid. Thank you, I just got a coffee delivery. But we also have, so our headers are now this large text. Our titles are styled as one thing, our metadata is bold, our entries are Roman, and all of those gray, it's a little fuzzy. we created these specific object styles to create these green pills. Oops. And that became, this is a very terrible render, but this book is actually 608 pages. It contained multiple scripts inside to export the index of indexes. And this is available for pre-order from Inventory Press. But if most of you are in Europe, many of these are on bookstore shelves in Europe currently. In the US, it's a bit delayed because of customs and shipping. But I hope you'll be able to check this out. Okay, running a little short on time, so I wanted to quickly run through 2 other web projects as well. So a different collaboration with Laura Combs was this workshop for the Southland Institute focusing on the asterisk as a political mark or an unstable sign. So for this Zoom workshop, for the introduction, we had each of our participants use the Zoom annotation tool to draw a line and write their name. So as we went through all of these 40 introductions, we ended up with this glyph, a singular mark that's quite cacophonous, but ends up representing an entire group. We had some other exercises in between, but for the sake of time, I'll just talk about this website itself. So we used a tool called Hypothesis.js, which is a plugin that you're able to annotate any text on any web page. So check out web.hypothesis.is. So we worked with Richard Caceres to create a custom site. I'm currently in the editor mode, and my doc is kind of covering this, so I'll make it smaller. But you'll see that I'm able to highlight text and add annotations. And this is like the back panel or CMS view that each person first went through. This was a Zoom exercise. They found 2 books in their house, and they pulled 2 excerpts from those books and transcribes them into the CMS. And that looked something like this. Sorry, I lost the end of this. Here it is. I generally have 4 or 5 books around the house. I live alone, and I can do this, and they are not books on the same subject. They don't relate to each other in any particular way, and the ideas they present bounce off of one another. And I like this effect. So I guess in that way, I'm using a kind of primitive So if we click Laura, we'll find that this was by Octavia Butler for an interview at MIT in 1998. So using this backend, or the CMS, people were adding entries. They were then highlighting different elements to add a text annotation or an image annotation or a sound annotation, and that would appear in line when you selected their name. So an example of an image annotation is by Lisa Mayone. And she created these drawings that would expand, and depending on your scroll position, would highlight different words to again create associative links between them. So as you click through everyone's name, on the front end, you'll see their annotations begin to populate in line with the primary text. So in doing so, we again create this cacophonous yet co-authored collective publication. With Richard, we also allowed for the ability to turn off the base layer. So that turns off the initial transcriptions and adds a primary reading experience of just the annotations themselves, with images, with text, with colors that everyone selected, and everyone's self-drawn asterisk. And as you turn off all of these, so Richard actually asked us if we wanted a button that just said turn on all turn on or off all, but we said no because we liked this meditative clicking moment. After you turn off everyone's name as well as the base layer, you're left with only their asterisks, which we felt referred back to that Ursula Le Guin text about the bag of stars, an example that she gave to talk about the contents within the container itself. So, I'd like to quickly close with a third project called Print Arena. So Arena is kind of like a research-based Pinterest, or a social network where you add some of your favorite bookmarks or any file form actually into different folders called channels. The Media Lab, Charles Brzezowski, who's one of the co-founders of Arena, and I created this tool called Print Arena, which allows you to pull in a channel, which looks something like this. This is one that I made with David Reinfurt, Charles Brzezowski, and myself. If you highlight this URL and plug it in, it converts the channel into a book. And for this, we are also using a third-party JavaScript library called bindery.js, which allows you to view this in multiple modes. So this is the flipbook version and the print preview. So we also use the template of Lulu's pocketbook size. Lulu is a print-on-demand service where you can upload a PDF and that prints as a book. But what we like about this is we believe that books and webs are so complementary. And as shown through Print Arena and also Cyberfeminism Index, books can also be coded. So the soft copy is typically considered fluid, dynamic, mutable, typically a digital format, whereas a hard copy is fixed, registered, permanent, typically found in books. But both of these things are mediated by an interface. We think of interactive and typically think of websites, but books are obviously quite interactive as well. And they both have a series of conventions that we are taught to replicate, even if we can completely break these norms. So a website has a top nav, it's tagged by certain elements, it's long and scrolling. A book begins with a foreword, a table of contents, the essays, and then back matter. But this can totally be reformatted. So even by changing location of a citation, moving acknowledgements to the front, all of these are breaking conventions of books and websites. So this is an example of the printed book using Lulu. This was for a channel called ORG Softwares. And some of the spreads inside. So this was primarily using a channel with text elements. And some of our final printed books and just copies or test prints within our Arena library. So with that, I would like to close, and it would be great to talk about this more through the Q&A, but thank you so much. I hope these projects kind of show how I've been thinking about not only the content of each of the entries, but also thinking about automated flows for designing the containers of each as well. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. Oops, that's the wrong. I have this, oh yeah, Jitsi is open now. Let me turn off screen sharing.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
There was one question already in the chat. How do you see the role between teaching and making?
Yeah, I think that it's, in the best way, the best kind of class almost feels like an R&D for your research and development. So if I'm teaching a class on critical collections, I actually get a lot of stimuli from what the other students or participants are doing. And in many ways, I really like thinking about how to co-author collective texts in all of these classes. So often thinking about exercises that allow people to contribute to a singular thing that kind of creates a snapshot or a document of the entire group. So for us, this feels quite special and feels like a mix of making and teaching. I think this gets more experimental when you can think of workshops themselves, like that app with Laura. That was a perfect example of us coming up with an experiment and then participants wanting to help us play with that thing, figure out what the breaking points of Hypothesis.js were, thinking about online publishing and collective publishing. So it happens, I think, more specifically in workshops because it's so contained, but this can definitely emerge in a longer semester length classroom structure as well.
Cool.
But thanks for that question.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it was also nice to see how that asterisk that you used was a collaborative effort and then translated into all these nice little stars and colors in the books. It was really nice. Are there any questions?
Exactly. Thank you.
Are there any questions here in the room? No. The work I have one question here in the chat. Always transitioning between physical space, virtual. The work you presented has a big focus on publishing workflows. Do you ever reuse a workflow, or do you make a new one for every project?
That's a great question. Let me think of one where we reused. Wow, I guess we have created a lot of workflows specific to each project because like the InDesign scripting one is open source and on GitHub, but it does feel very specific to our design template. If anyone's used like JavaScript or data merge, you'll find that InDesign it's hard to replicate if you're using a different design. Print Arena I've used a lot in my classes, but maybe not for additional projects. I feel like I often use Print CSS across most of my websites, and this is just something that you can use as a separate CSS file. So maybe not necessarily a workflow, but definitely like a templated structure that I modify so a website can print out nicely as a printed page or a PDF. This question inspires me to reuse some of these workflows because it's so much work to make. So maybe it's worth recycling and modifying in some way. So maybe the next project you'll see, I'll have mashed together some of these workflows and outputs to develop something new. But thanks for that seed of inspiration.
Nice.
Yeah.
I was thinking, so you made the feminist index, and there are many different kinds of feminism: xenofeminism, glitch feminism, ecofeminism. And I was wondering how, like, by indexing it, could you make also the connections between the different, like, how they influence each other? Or I'm just wondering.
Absolutely. I think that in the cyberfeminism term, so this allowed us to gather a lot of different strands underneath it, including what you've mentioned, like xenofeminism, glitch feminism, feminist Afrofuturism, hack feministas in Latin America, net femis in Korea. All of these groups have different titles, but thematically, many of their things feel similar, right? It's being critical about the dissemination of technology, or it's the dissemination of feminism through online channels, and it's a criticism of technology through that dispersion. So this feedback loop seems to be apparent in all of these examples, regardless of its subheader. I think also because the book is an annotated chronology, it really shows how these movements have shifted and emerged over time. So xenofeminism emerging in 2016, glitch feminism being published in 2018, but first as an essay in 2013. We see how it changes over that time. But also how some of these things, even if they're following the same themes, aren't actually coming from the same nucleus. So many people think that cyberfeminism starts with Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and then branches out from there, when in fact, cyberfeminism, in my understanding, has felt more like a rhizome or a decentralized network, where things were kind of popping up in different regions depending on when the internet was adopted, and then creating work in contrast or in response to that. So sometimes groups had no idea what others were doing, have no reference to Donna Haraway, and yet still thinking about cyborgian themes, still thinking about techno-feminism. And this was actually really fascinating to observe. So yeah, if you kind of scroll through the index, or if you end up getting a printed copy, it is kind of a nice way to see an expansive lens into what cyberfeminism, as blurry and imperfect as that term may be, has looked for the past 3 decades, from 1991 to present, but also how to suggest how it might mutate in the future.
Thanks.
Thank you.
How did the making of this book also change your practice? Were there any things that stood out that really influenced you?
I mean, maybe this is more of a production comment, but having designed books in the past, but never done the content and the design, it was really surprising to me how many constraints were put on it because of production, budgets, weight, broadsheet size, etc. So we had so design goals for this podcast. We actually had a lot of constraints on size, on color. Most of it's black and white, but there are about 100 colored pages instead of having the whole thing in color. We still wanted to use system fonts, so we used Arial. And we wanted to design our own pill, so Karenev had to create a hack of Arial because you're not allowed to modify it to create different typefaces. And then going into the process of like shipping and distribution and warehouses, that was a huge learning curve and something that people would never see from the other side because we're just used to seeing these books on shelves or ordering online. But for me, it was quite eye-opening. So whatever design conceptions we had a year and a half ago radically changed depending on the other constraints, the timelines, what papers had available, because there was this huge paper shortage because of COVID impacted supply chains. So maybe not the most illuminating answer, but for me, that was like a learning curve.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's nice that it ties back to our previous talk, talking about constraints. I've got another question here. A lot of the design decisions are made by referencing parts of history or internet culture, such as the web face, typeface, Arial code designed by a woman. How do you curate such a reference decision into a coherent wall?
That's a great question. I think that some of my peers are some of the best designers of our generation. And when I was looking at their work, from when I was an undergrad to now, I always felt like a sort of imposter syndrome or fear of the blank page. When I see a blank InDesign template or any media, it doesn't fill me with this urge to like pour some creative output onto that page. Instead, I feel a bit stuck. So what I realized was it's not that necessarily that my peers are more talented or harder workers, though they definitely are talented and hard workers. I realized that it's because they have an obsessive rigor over the idea of creating new graphic forms. And I did not feel that same sort of obsession. I found that I did have a certain obsession about connecting disparate pieces together and really diving into research. So when compiling all these elements of research, then the project almost designs itself. So referencing the spreadsheet, referencing early internet infrastructure, referencing the Talmud, all of these things begin to create additional constraints into the design and no longer feel just like this blank page. So for me, I've really learned that my method is first developing content, having that lead to a lot of research and historical research, and then letting those two things really inform the design. So for me, it's a form of creative expression, but it's also a form of figuring out the appropriate container that the research really supports. So if anyone out there also doesn't feel this kind of obsession over just formal output, I would really encourage you to think about other ways of developing other methodologies that bring you life and like make you energized, and that might lead to a workflow that actually feels quite generative.
Cool, thanks. Does anyone have a question here in the room? I've got one more coming in. What role does code play in your practice?
I think that code is really important because I can build a microsite pretty quickly. I'm like very comfortable in HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript, some jQuery. But for some of the sites that Feminism Index, I always work with a backend developer. But for me, all of these websites are also sketched in the browser. So I typically don't make a sketch in InDesign or whatever. So many of these new web design tools. I typically open up I typically just sketch in the browser depending on these other references. So I'll have ideas for like what elements go where, but the prototyping really does exist in code itself. I think this also then informs the workflow. So the Southland site is something that we coded and prototyped first. The Cyberfeminist Index front end, I coded and prototyped in the browser. Print Arena was actually coded by Cab, and we designed that elsewhere. But if you look at all these other sites, my portfolio site, the Cyberfeminism touring site, all of these are quick microsites that I've always felt more comfortable kind of moving it around on the page rather than designing it in code. So that's felt like a generative workflow for me also.
Another question is, how do you relate to projects of other makers that use your open source publishing tools?
Oh, I don't know if I've seen people develop works using the content of Cyberfeminism Index, but they're typically such different media that I can, if anything, include them back into the index. So one person entries in the index to create this AI-generated sound art piece, reading through all the manifestos. One student sent me a publication, created a manifesto or a collection of all the manifestos in the index. And that's also included back within the primary index itself. But in terms of like Print Arena, that's open, and I actually don't know if people did it. I must have, because BindaryJ is fairly straightforward to use, has been online for a while. But that's a good question. Maybe I should kind of look through what other people have adapted based on these projects. Because coding-wise, I'm actually not sure who's adapted some of these things, though I've certainly adapted some of those scripts for.
Thanks. I have another question. So you work also as a professor of art criticism. How does that background as art critic also help you to review or document code or technical projects?
Yeah, I think because I have a coding background as well as a writing and historical background, both of these things really inform when reviewing projects, especially if they're web-based, but also just new media in general, or even books. I feel like all of these things, it creates a different reference base than maybe some of the other critics who have different backgrounds. Sorry, I'm a little under the weather, so I'm losing my voice. But being able to relate a work that you see to a previous work or a referential work, I think creates a lot of associative ties, as well as giving some historical understanding to why they're intuitively choosing that design or art direction, I think is quite helpful. And most importantly, able to inject a lot of criticism into the work that they're doing so they understand critically and conceptually why they've made certain intuitive moves. So in many ways, it helps some of the students post-conceptualize what they've done and connect it to a movement or an architecture or some sort of social moment. So I think that always figuring out where this lives in a social climate is really important.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Are there any other questions here? Well, I think no. Online also not. So thanks a lot, and hope you get better soon. Thanks a lot for
Thank
your
you so
talk. And I think we'll have to wrap up if nobody has any other questions.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the facilitation and the invitation. I look forward to connecting online.
People in the chat say you're amazing. So
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank everyone for joining. This was the second iteration, and we'll be continuously working on a third iteration. So hopefully see you all next year. And thank you, Vera. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you, everyone, for joining here. Thanks, all the crew. Thanks, all the funders. Thank you. Thanks.